Hey friends, Kenny Ortiz here. In this video, we're going to be talking about the different views of the image of God. This video is being primarily recorded for my students at Bethany Global University, but I'm going to make this live on YouTube, so I know many others, people who follow me on YouTube, Twitter, podcast listeners will get this as well. So anyone watching this, if you have a question, feel free to reach out to me. If you're one of my students, you can shoot me an email or a text. And if you're watching this on YouTube and you're not one of my students, just feel free to leave a comment below, and I'll be glad to get back to you. Okay, in this video, we're going to talk about the image of God. I talked about this in a previous video, but Genesis 1 basically tells us that we are made in the image of God. But there are varying views to how this plays out. So the idea of the image and likeness of God, this is theologians frequently use the Latin term Imago Dei. This is understanding that we are created with, we're created in the image of God or like God in some ways. And there are three different ways in which different theologians argue for what this actually looks like. And so, as you'll see on the screen there, the first view, which is kind of the more traditional, most prominent view held by a lot of Christians throughout church history, is what we would call the substantive view of the image of God. The substantive view of the image of God is that we are, or this could also be called the full or literal view. And this really has elements of that we are psychologically and spiritually made to be like God. And so this is the view I largely hold to. So those of you who have seen my previous video about the image of God from Genesis 1, much of how I describe the image of God is largely the substantive view. The substantive view basically is that humans are created with elements of God inside of them, right? That God takes portions of himself, or elements and attributes of his own character, nature, and he endows it into human beings, both collectively as a whole. All of humanity collectively together has certain elements of the character and nature of God delegated to it, or endowed within it. And then individually, individual people have individual elements of the character and nature of God endowed in us. And it is unique from person to person how God endows himself into me versus how God endows himself into someone else might be different or unique. And so we're all different because God is creating us to reflect him, but we all reflect God a little bit differently. And then you have a gender component there, where God has taken elements of himself and endowed it in men and men only, and then elements of himself that he's endowed in women and women only. And so you have kind of a corporate collective as a whole. You have kind of two groups, men and women, and then you have the individuals. So that's the substantive view of the image of God. That's how that. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself here. The other view, as you see on the screen there, is the relational view. This view has gotten some popularity amongst modern evangelicals, also amongst liberal theologians. This tends to be somewhat popular amongst neo-Orthodox theologians. This tends to be popular, but this is known as the relational view. This view says that when God created, when Genesis 1 says that God created us in his image, that all that means is that we relate to one another the same way the members of the Trinity relate to one another. That God the Father, God the Son, they relate to one another a certain way, and therefore that humans relate to one another in the same way. People who hold to an exclusive relational view, meaning they say we believe the relational view and we reject the other two views, these people would frequently say you should not assume that the character and nature of God, or the attributes of the character and nature of God, are somehow endowed humanity. You should not assume that we are like God in that way. You should only assume that we are like God in the way we relate to one another, or the way we relate to creation. And so I actually believe it could be both. I would embrace the substantive view and the relational view, and you can do that. They're not mutually exclusive. So there are people like me that would say I agree with both of these views. But most of the people who hold to an exclusive relational view tend to reject the others, or that they tend to have, not just reject, obviously, because if they're exclusive, they would be rejecting the others. But they almost have what I would call a hostile attitude. People who embrace the relational views tend to have a very have almost animosity. It seems like this is my opinion, but it comes across to me as this combative, like those other views are ridiculous. We have to kind of stamp those out of evangelicalism. That's kind of again, and that's popular amongst neo-Orthodox peoples and liberal theologians who largely probably wouldn't identify with evangelicalism anyway. The third view is the functional view. And the functional view of the image of God is a minority view. Not many people hold this, but this view basically says that when God created Adam and Eve, and God says that Adam and Eve are made in my image, he's basically saying the way they function within creation. So God is a governor over heaven and earth. And we as humans are the governors over the heavens of the earth. Later in Genesis 1, it says that we are to subdue the earth. We are called to be the masters or the rulers, the governors over this entire planet. We are called to be the ones that rule everything on this planet, just as God is the ruler of all things in heaven and everything under heaven, and the created order. So God is over us, but God has delegated our power so that when we read in Genesis 1 that God says, let's make God in our image, the only assumption that we should make is that God is saying, let's create a being that will then rule over the earth the way we rule over everything. That's the earth and beyond. And therefore, we should not assume that humans relate to one another in the way that the Trinity relates to one another. We should not assume that we are endowed with elements of the character and nature of God. Although this is a minority view, it is popular amongst certain peoples. And one of the reasons why this view can get traction amongst certain types of Christians is someone says, well, particularly if someone is in favor of same-sex marriages. Someone says, homosexuality is not a sin. Two men should be allowed to get married. And if I say, well, the Trinity, like the nature of the Trinity is that their persons are unique. So I believe when I look at the substantive or the relational view, God is, if I take one of those two views, God is teaching us that we as humans are to reflect God, which means when we unite with someone within marriage, it should be two people that are distinct or different, right? The Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are different. Therefore, we should emulate that in our marriages. If you take the functional view, you would say, no, we should not emulate that. So it gives you some latitude now to basically discount the traditional understanding of marriage to some extent. Not always. There are people who embrace the functional view exclusively. They would reject the other two views, but they would not necessarily embrace same-sex marriage. So it's not across the board always, but it does give some latitude for that. So I personally actually give credence to all three of them. And you can do that. You can believe the substantive view and the relational view and the functional view. I do believe that when God created humanity, he was creating us in a functional sense for us to govern all things the way he governs all things. We are to reflect him in that way. I also believe it's relational, that we are to relate to one another in the way that Trinity relates to one another. And I believe in the substantive view, that we are made in the image of God in a more literal sense, in a more psychological or spiritual sense, that our makeup is similar to God, that our anthropology, that the composition of humanity is made to be like the composition of God in some ways, right? Not exactly, of course, but there are elements of the character and nature of God in which we are created. Now, there are ways in which we are extremely different than God, right? There are attributes of God that are God's alone, that he has not imputed or endowed in humans, that he's not given to us. There are elements of how God operates that he has not delegated to humanity by any means. But the fullness of humanity, our substance, our composition, how we are created and made up, is to look like God. Right? Psychologically speaking, our personalities, our spirituality, who we are, the way we're created, is like God in many different ways. And I believe in a relational sense and a functional sense. So I actually think when I read through Genesis and I read through all of the Bible and I study psychology and anthropology, I walk away with the understanding that we're actually made like God in all of these ways, not just one or the other. And I think that's a viable way to approach it. But there are people out there that only take one of those three. Frequently, people who take the functional view are rejecting the others, and some of those people then use that as one of their arguments in favor of same-sex marriage. People who tend to take the relational view exclusively, who reject the other two, tend to be, in my opinion, a little more combative toward the other views in some ways, but that tends to be held. It's more of a modern view that's really held more by the neo-Orthodox peoples. So anyway, those are the three views of the image of God. For those of you who are in my course, Gender and Sexuality, you don't need to know these in super detail, but it's just good to have a general understanding of the image of God, because when we have conversations about same-sex relationships down the road, some of our understandings of this will begin to play out in some of those conversations. So hopefully it's helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email or shoot me a text if you're in my class, or if you're not in my class, feel free to leave a comment below and I will respond. Love you guys.